Lecture 111, July 5, 1960. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last session we discussed certain aspects of the theory of ideology. But it is now time to tell you, or rather explicitly underline for you, for this has of course been implicit in all of these lectures so far, that the theory of ideology constitutes the real stumbling block where the controversy between philosophy and sociology is concerned. The fundamental argument is that the claim to the objectivity of truth, as this is upheld by philosophy, is essentially undermined by sociology, since the latter, instead of actually addressing questions of truth, already subjects every idea of objective truth to doubt by suspecting it of ideology. Sociology allegedly tries to replace insight into any kind of binding truth or validity by exposing the source of the thesis in question. Now you will all be more or less aware that, during the Third Reich, the discipline of sociology fell victim to such objections as this, or, as I would prefer to say, to such pretended objections as this. Yet the intellectual attitude which finds expression in this particular schema or prejudice has certainly not been banished entirely even now. I recently encountered something of this kind in relation to a book of mine in which certain social aspects of music played a specific role. One of the most highly regarded German critics, and one incidentally who was by no means entirely unsympathetic to my own writings, responded to the way in which I indicated certain social relationships at work here with the apodictic claim that it was well known that he himself rejected the idea of such a relationship between music and society, and that this was really just a matter of personal opinion too. Now I believe that this attempt to convert such questions into an issue of personal belief, one person sees cultural and intellectual things in the context of society, another person will have nothing to do with this approach. It just depends on the sort of person you are, really belongs in a pre-scientific sphere of thought. In other words, it shirks the necessity of knowledge, where such social connections could really be established, or at least tries at some point to call a halt to the process of knowing, and turns instead to the field of subjective preferences. But if someone cannot feel the connection between Beethoven's music and the ideas of humanity which were still very much alive in Germany in the period following the French Revolution, if someone cannot feel in Richard Wagner the connection with imperialism and the pessimism of a class that no longer has a future, if someone cannot feel in Richard Strauss anything of the tremendous entrepreneurial elan that his music captures, I would have to say that their actual experience of the object itself is to some extent impoverished, and that they simply perceive less in terms of the object in question. 3. If the intellectual and cultural things in our experience assume any life at all for us, this life actually consists in their relation to the social world. But this relationship to the social is beyond mere conjecture, since the mediations that are involved can be established well beyond any merely biographical or merely genetic connections. Thus when we say, for example, that the history of painting or the history of music in a sense arises on the historical basis of bourgeois society itself, we can identify the relevant mediating factors here, albeit in a rather abstract and general way. For the advancing power of technology, namely the advancing control over the material of nature which goes hand in hand with the development of bourgeois rationality itself, this progress in technology and in the rational domination of natural material is precisely what furnishes the principle in accordance with which, in the fields of art I have chosen to mention here, the productive forces have unfolded and the history of these arts has developed. In saying this, however, I have no intention of denying the internal or immanent character to be found in the history of cultural and intellectual products. Thus I do not wish to deny that there is such a thing as the history of mind or spirit, although I would harbor reservations about treating this history in too self-contained a way and hypostasizing it as a kind of pure cultural or intellectual history. I do believe, however, that the forces which constitute this history of spirit, and in a way that to this day has admittedly never been fully analyzed in really concrete terms, must be described in large measure as social forces, even though one is hardly aware of them as such. In other words, the productive forces which unfold in the cultural and intellectual sphere are actually none other than those which unfold in the process of society as a whole. And the task of revealing the mediations which are involved here in a genuinely concrete manner is one that has barely been addressed as yet. the social examination of cultural and intellectual matters is something that has fallen into discredit only through the wretched habit of simply coordinating the expressions and creations of culture with certain social trends or even social groups, and doing so in a way that is decreed from above. No real attempt is made to disclose the cultural objects themselves in terms of their own immanent character or their own intrinsic meaning. And there is no doubt that the Marxian theory of ideology, from a relatively early point onwards, and certainly already with Mehring IV, bears considerable responsibility for this simplification and vulgarization of the concept of ideology, a process which has effectively triumphed in the East today. But I don't really want to get into all this in detail here. We shall have more to say about it in due course, since this is a crucial question where the relationship between society and culture, between sociology and philosophy, is concerned. Here I would just like to consider this complex of issues in the light of the ideas we have tried to explore in the last few sessions, and which I hope may now start to prove fruitful. What I mean is that the theory of ideology in its strict form, as I presented it earlier and as Herr Horkheimer explained it to you as a necessary form of false consciousness, is precisely not one that relativizes the concept of truth. On the contrary, as I pointed out in the last few lectures, it actually holds fast to an objective concept of truth. It is a remarkable fact that those versions of the theory of ideology, or, perhaps I should say, those formulations of the sociology of knowledge which do represent forms of skeptical relativism and thus express a weakened conception of knowledge, are approaches which specifically fail to employ the concept of ideology in its really strict formulation. These are all later and somewhat etiolated expressions of the theory of ideology. In other words, I am talking here of what we might call the totalized concept of ideology, an approach which seems to intensify the concept of ideology to the greatest possible degree and extend it way beyond its merely particular classical formulation, although it actually ends up by fundamentally weakening and eventually destroying the concept of ideology. Now everything is ideology, which is just what we find in the radically relativist and skeptical positivist doctrine of Vilfredo Pareto 5. In other words, everything is equally true and equally untrue, so that the only direct conclusion to be drawn here is actually that power alone decides the matter. A theoretical transition that was openly and, I would say, almost innocently endorsed in the early period of Italian fascism before it was specifically recommended in propagandistic terms in Germany under the auspices of Herr Goebbels. In the early writings of Mussolini, who expressly regarded himself as a disciple and advocate of Pareto, you will easily recognize this obvious transition from universal philosophical relativism to the doctrine of power that was espoused by fascism, as I have already indicated to you. 6. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say that, if you really want to achieve anything fruitful with the concept of ideology, if you wish to avoid the kind of cliched thinking that says, "Ah, so that's where it comes from," it can't be worth anything after all. This is the kind of thinking which disposes of the expressions of mind and culture on account of their ancestry, just as it has occasionally disposed of whole groups of people on exactly the same grounds. In response to such thinking, I believe you cannot do better than take the expressions of mind and culture seriously in themselves and try to explore their truth and their untruth, their inner coherence or their incoherence. The path which offers insight with regard to ideology is not that of abstract classification but the path of determinate critique. The spirit of supposedly total suspicion with regard to ideology, the kind of defeatism which imagines it is already entitled to ignore intellectual and cultural experience itself because it can point out the origins from which the expressions of mind or spirit have arisen, this sort of approach, rather than preserving any genuine critical power, should actually and more appropriately be compared with the skeptical mentality of an old hand who has seen far too much in his life and now basically regards everything as equally true and equally untrue. Yet everything that belongs to mind or spirit implicitly makes a claim to truth. And even when, subjectively speaking, this is not the case, when the film producer who actually makes rubbish is perfectly ready to admit at the party after his third whiskey that this is all that it is, we find that his creations involve a number of features that indirectly recall moments which belong to the traditional work of art, moments which bear on the claim to truth content. That is why such creations still have something about them which both evokes and contrasts with the question concerning truth. The only appropriate approach to the things of mind or spirit is one that tries to explore their immanent truth content, their immanent substance. The question concerning ideology in a sense loses its meaning where really significant works are concerned, for if ideology is actually nothing but false consciousness, we could also say that ideological expressions of culture are really just bad expressions of culture. In order to decide what a good or a bad expression of culture is, we cannot appeal to topological considerations about where a given expression of culture is to be correctly located. The only thing which helps here is to enter into the heart of the matter itself, for every other approach remains abstract in the pejorative sense, that is, imagines that it can spare itself any serious engagement with mind or spirit and its substantial expression simply by recourse to the entirely generalized idea that mind or spirit is essentially dependent on society. Such an approach already fails to recognize what is decisive here, namely the difference between genuine and false consciousness, for that is something that can be determined only immanently rather than externally through some abstract process of coordination or through exercising the famous suspicion of ideology. This sort of suspicion, the wholly general recognition that everything connected with mind or spirit has something or other to do with society, initially says absolutely nothing about the matter in question, above all because the fact that something or other has arisen within the context of something else says nothing as yet about the truth of what has arisen or not arisen, as the case may be. You are only really tempted to believe that it does, since we are all more or less victims of the mythological idea that what is true and exists intrinsically as something eternal and immutable cannot have arisen or come to be. This is the idea that there must be something absolutely first in the order of being, as prima philosophia has always claimed to show, and that something is already disqualified if it comes from somewhere. On the one hand, of course, everything comes from somewhere, but this completely abstract way of relating something valid to its genesis is by no means equivalent to making an appropriate judgment with regard to the matter in question, for it actually tends in general to avoid such judgments. Now it is characteristic of the whole period of the theory of ideology in its declining phase, as I would describe it, since it essentially dissolved the Marxian conception of ideology precisely by extending it too far, that it does not really get beyond this abstract theory of dependence, or at best simply produces certain correlations between ideology and society without actually being able to establish any relation to what is true or false in the matter in question. In this regard, the late bourgeois theory of ideology that we find in Pareto or Mannheim cannot really be distinguished from the alternative extreme that is currently endorsed in the Eastern Bloc, namely that mechanical application of the theory of ideology which equally avoids engaging with the experience of the inner logic or otherwise of the expressions of mind or culture that it chooses to consider. In short, it is not actually the critique of ideology that is relativistic. Rather, it is the kind of absolutism that is so popular these days, namely the belief in those celebrated absolutely binding values that we try so hard to maintain because we think that we cannot possibly manage without them. It does not occur to us that the very rigidity of these values which we want to endorse is itself simply a reflection of the rigid and reified consciousness that searches for such values without even reflecting that this need itself, this need for a supposedly firm foundation, as yet says nothing about what is really at stake. At this point we must not fail to recognize Nietzsche's insight that the need for some substantial spiritual reality hardly suffices to prove that such a thing exists. If I fear that I shall die and be lost for all eternity, and thus infer my immortality from this fear of death, then this itself is more a proof of mortality, as Nietzsche says somewhere, than it is a proof of immortality. 7 And I would say that there is actually precious little difference between the painful need for so-called eternal values, which we see around us today and is so anxious to defame any critical reflection on things, and the general attitude which I have been describing for you. Perhaps you will allow me at this point, in these otherwise quite objectively oriented lectures, to address a few words directly to you regarding your own personal attitude and fundamental orientation. For I would specifically like to warn you about the danger of apologetic thinking. In other words, I would like to warn you against regarding thought as a means or instrument that is meant to provide you with something or other that you can firmly hold on to, that will basically reconfirm for you something that is already in force, something which has already been confirmed by the tradition. For it is an essential and distinctive character of thought that it remains open, and to think in accordance with premises which already effectively sanction the result of thought, in the sense of some particular and established positivity, even before it has abandoned itself to its own movement. To think in this way is to engage in pseudo-activity, to indulge in a spurious kind of thinking altogether. If you look upon your studies as anything more than the acquisition of technical knowledge or expertise for the purpose of proving your academic credentials, then I would say that there is a crucial moral problem that every one of you will basically have to confront at some point or another. In other words, you must summon the intellectual courage to avoid letting your thoughts simply be dictated to or regulated in advance by everything one is already supposed to endorse or believe, whether it be as a Marxist, as a Christian, as a liberal, or whatever it may be. Thus in all of the judgments you make you should beware of this ominousness which invariably belongs to the sphere of heteronomy, the heteronomy which you have effectively relinquished as soon as you seriously undertake to study something, in other words, as soon as you seriously attempt to understand something on the basis of your own reason and your own knowledge, although we are constantly in danger of falling back into such heteronomy under the overwhelming pressure of the world in which we live. That the power of thinking may destroy something, whatever it may be, is no argument against this thinking if such destruction appears compelling, that is, if the thing itself calls for destruction. For destruction of this kind, if we are talking about genuine thinking here rather than a merely sophistical exercise of ingenuity, is not an unmotivated play of thought that is simply intent on tearing something down, as people like to say. Rather, it is motivated by the thing itself, which is all that justifies such thinking. And if a thing is bad, it also deserves to be recognized in thought as the bad and inadequate thing that it is. When we try and avoid this, when we fail to confront it, and even regard such avoidance as a higher kind of ethos, we are acting more pharisaically rather than more ethically. And if you learn anything at all in these lectures, it should be a fundamental self-criticism with regard to this attitude which threatens to reassert itself on all sides today to a quite disturbing degree. The concept of the positive which people love to employ in this connection has itself already assumed a rigid, ossified and reified form. Thus as soon as we start looking round for so-called values, we see that things which once enjoyed a substantial living presence within a culture have already become alienated from us, have already ceased to be binding on us, and are now abstractly fixed and retained as values. I would almost say that, as soon as we explicitly start asking about values, we find that the values in question for that very reason no longer actually exist, that such things are only falsified when they are grasped in terms of the category of value, one which specifically derives from the sphere of political economy and, not by accident, reflects the mere relation of exchange. That we should have something solid to hold on to, that we want to bind ourselves to something reliable, cannot possibly be a criterion for anything. For science in the emphatic sense, namely the kind of knowledge which is not limited simply to the acquisition of expertise or information, really begins only when we move out into the open space of thought, when we completely relinquish the illusory notion that thought must yield or produce something wholly determinate, like the profit we secure through haggling. Anyone who would measure thinking by this yardstick soon falls back into dogmatism, and I would just remind you that, with very good reason, Kant actually treated dogmatism and skepticism as equivalent to each other. The reason for this is simply that what I happen to accept dogmatically, when I take or believe something to be true without being involved in this truth myself, or without spontaneously recognizing this truth on my own part, can just as easily be replaced, according to the pragmatic considerations of the moment, by something else that is accepted in an equally blind and heteronomous way. Thus, objectively speaking, once reason has abdicated its task of distinguishing between truth and untruth, we see how the dogmatic approach and the skeptical approach immediately pass over into each other. A thinker who halts the process of thinking in order to preserve something or other, and today this has already shrunk to something as thin and meager as being as such has thereby merely abandoned thought to arbitrariness. The thinker thus works against just what he had hoped to hold on to precisely by undermining its claim to truth. Thus he no longer even raises a claim to truth, but rather, for the sake of that reified possession of something he could not contemplate losing, he now just posits and manipulates it. What is truly relativistic, ladies and gentlemen, is not the exercise of trenchant critical insight but the blind acceptance of a truth that could be just as easily exchanged for another one. Such a need actually reflects what I would describe as a reified consciousness, that is, a consciousness which no longer really achieves a living experience of objects. This consciousness is at once both rigid and changeable. In other words, it operates with hard and fast categories yet is also intrinsically capable of arbitrarily exchanging certain aspects or moments for a whole range of different ones. At some point in the not-too-distant future I hope to offer you a developed theory of reified consciousness, 9 as I had already done with regard to the phenomenon of half-education. 10 Just let me say here that the reified consciousness takes the object and advance as something rigid and alien to the subject, and typically as something conventional or externally approved. While, on the side of the subject, the reified consciousness actually comes to resemble a thing, in other words, increasingly adapts to the prevailing world of things, to the preponderant power of the existing order. In accommodating itself to what is as it now is, without any apparent alternative, such consciousness imagines that it can actually secure and acquire, in an external way, those normative features which had already been lost to it precisely because it cannot distinguish between true and false, because it no longer has access to living experience. What I just want to say, ladies and gentlemen, if you will forgive me this outburst of pedagogic eros, is that you must take care, and take care above everything else, to recognize the dangers of this reified consciousness, one which nowadays has developed an entire vocabulary for itself, and I will not even try to qualify this claim 11, that will allow you to identify the typical thought forms of just such reified consciousness. I would say it is probably more important than anything else that I might say to you in particular about the relationship between sociology and philosophy if I encourage you in your own intellectual life to do everything you possibly can to resist this reification of consciousness, which has probably infected all of us in one form or another. One has only to think, for example, of the division or separation of knowledge into a sphere of facts, which belong in sociology, and one of ideas, which belong in philosophy, or, again, of the separation between the question of genesis, which belongs in sociology, and the question of validity, which belongs in philosophy, or whatever other rigid dichotomies you care to mention. These habitual modes of thinking, which fundamentally underlie the controversy between sociology and philosophy, are themselves actually nothing other than an expression of such reified consciousness. And the most important task for the theory of knowledge today, with regard to human cultural and intellectual life generally, is surely to show that these rigid pairs of concepts which are effectively presented to us as if they had nothing to do with each other, in truth only represent the rupture between consciousness and objectivity. They merely mirror or reflect that state of alienation which the need for values, for being, for rootedness, for a sustaining center, or whatever it may be, hopes to escape. This I believe is the central thought which should enable you to address the fundamental problem of philosophy and sociology with which you will surely continue to be confronted. I am perfectly aware, of course, that whatever I can say to you on this subject is really nothing but a formal indication that you will have to realize and develop in terms of your own thought and experience, although I certainly cannot presume to articulate this thought for you here with any genuine rigor. This reified consciousness, this consciousness which seeks something it can rely on externally and hardens itself in the process, is simply the correlate of the administered world. Thus what is relativistic here, if I may repeat the point, is certainly not the realm of living experience that resists such consciousness. On the contrary, we find that there is actually a profound affinity between the blindness of a reified consciousness which simply accepts things without immanently engaging with them and the relativistic habit of thinking for which any truth can arbitrarily be replaced by another one. And this holds for our attitude or position in relation to any theory. Today any theory can be snapped up and abused by reified consciousness. There are no theories which enjoy any special privilege in this regard or are intrinsically protected against this mechanism. Even a theory such as the Marxian one, in which the concept of reification plays such a significant role, 12 is by no means immune to reified consciousness simply because it specifically reflects on this concept. The apologetic need that I have described as the real enemy of living consciousness is actually the expression of a weakened consciousness, an expression of anxiety, which nonetheless points back to an entire social order which we still have every conceivable reason to fear, just as we had before. It might initially be possible to repress this anxiety by looking for the sort of value system we mentioned and trying to take our bearings from that system. But such repression works no better than any other kind, as psychology teaches us. The sense of security that we gain by finding something we can rely on, as we say, is paid for by an even greater sense of insecurity and anxiety when we realize that we do not really believe in what we are clinging to and have merely produced it because we need it. What is intellectually demanded of us, therefore, before we can even engage with the concept of ideology, is to open ourselves to the living experience of the thing itself instead of prejudging the matter by imposing external correlations upon it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if I may leave these reflections for the moment, you may also have learned something else from the considerations we have pursued so far. And this is that the correlations between theoretical forms and social forces which you are probably used to regarding as more or less self-evident or straightforward cannot really be described as such. Consider, for example, the culturally conservative or traditionalist theory of ideology which over 30 years ago now was particularly associated with the name of Max Scheler, a colleague of mine from the early Frankfurt days and a figure of considerable intellectual stature. 13 He produced a kind of catalogue which sought to establish a correlation between intellectual thought forms and some specific social outlook, or certain social tendencies, and even, if possible, particular social groups. Thus Scheler claimed that revolutionary thought was essentially a form of nominalistic thought, 14 whereas conservative thought was essentially Platonic realist in orientation, and he offered other correlations of this kind. Now I think I have already said enough in the last few sessions, although we didn't go into this in detail, and I would ask you to think back on our earlier discussion here, to show the inadequacies of such an approach. Let us just consider nominalism, the view that sees individual things alone, or, in the idiom of modern positivism, individual facts alone, as that which truly exists. By contrast, it regards all concepts, and in the last analysis all theory, simply as the abbreviated expression of the facts which they subsume, and it refuses to grant any genuine significance to theory itself. 15 Now according to Scheler's theory, and I would say this holds for ordinary consciousness as well, it appears that nominalism is intrinsically critical and revolutionary, that it dissolves established ideas in a skeptical spirit, whereas Platonism, by contrast, is conservative, static, preservative and, indeed, noble in comparison with that common or plebeian element that, so we have all been told, is essential to nominalism. I think that the considerations we have already pursued will have shown you that this is not actually the case. From the late medieval period onwards the emerging bourgeois culture struggled against a feudalism oriented towards a philosophy of conceptual realism, and did so in increasingly nominalist terms. Right up to the threshold of the modern period, the age which is marked by names such as Saint Simon and Kant, philosophical nominalism has actually been connected in a specific way with the interests of the revolutionary class of the time, namely the bourgeois class. And the great bourgeois theorists who criticized feudalism, such as Locke in his first treatise, 16 were also nominalists without exception. But then we notice that a peculiar functional change also starts to take place. When a theoretical understanding of society, and thus the claim to grasp something about the essence of society by passing beyond mere appearances, had effectively entered philosophy by way of Hegel, and when in terms of real social conflicts the bourgeois order was obliged to defend itself against newly emerging social forces, was obliged, in other words, to assume an increasingly apologetic posture, It did not turn back to the theory of conceptual realism, to Platonism, or anything of the sort. That was something that occurred only at a much later phase, with Schiller for example, and even then only in a more or less desultory fashion. Rather, what actually happened, and this is perhaps characteristic for the life of ideologies in relation to society generally, is that the nominalist theory was retained qua nominalism, though now employed to serve in a way that was completely opposed to its original function. For early nominalism was fundamentally critical towards the idea of the objective existence of essences, etc., and you will all know that the tremendous development of the modern natural sciences was effectively made possible by renouncing the whole construction of essences and the idea of objectively existing substantial forces. But from a certain point onwards we see how the same nominalism simply becomes a means of refusing any conception of the social whole that attempts to go beyond the facade of the immediately given, a means of defaming any such approach as arbitrary, as nothing but an airy and ungrounded construction. Nominalism thus becomes a way of denigrating theory qua theory, as we would say today, or making us suspicious of theoretical thought right from the start for the sake of a world which cannot intrinsically be justified in the light of the concept or any theoretical reflection. In this sense the whole positivist movement is to a large extent intrinsically ideological because it effectively prevents reflection on the hypokeimenon. 17. The underlying substance or hidden essence of society, and promotes the cult of strictly observable facts instead. In other words, a theory which assumed a critical or revolutionary significance in the context of one social phase, and can actually still exercise it in another social phase may then also come to serve apologetic purposes without changing that much in its purely theoretical form. Where theoretical form is concerned, it is not particularly easy to discern any great differences between Hume, on the one hand, and Ernst Mach and Avenarius, and ultimately recent logical positivism, on the other, yet the social function of these theories has almost been reversed. Here again you can see how important it is to avoid the kind of reified consciousness that would attempt in a purely static way to identify some theory or other as the ideology of a particular class or a particular constellation of interests. What determines the functional significance of a theory in the context of society is the specific social juncture we are talking about, the relevant social totality, rather than the ephemeral doctrinal content, or, as perhaps I should say, the doctrinal content taken merely on its own, of the particular theories in question. We shall pick up the discussion from here 18 on Thursday next 19 Lecture 121, July 7, 1960. Ladies and gentlemen, let us recall what I was saying to you at the end of the last session in connection with our reflections on the theory of ideology as a typical area of conflict between philosophy and sociology. I pointed out that, although individual ideologies originally emerged in specific social contexts, and thus also received their original significance from these same contexts, this does not mean that these ideologies, in terms of their material content or their truth content, are simply exhausted by the function they assumed in those contexts, or that they constantly exercise the same function over time. I also attempted to show that a specific intellectual